lives. He has published extensively in leading international academic journals, including Journal of European Public Policy, Local Government Studies, Urban Affairs Review, and Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. In 2024, he also published the monograph, The Multilayered Governance of Migration in Italy. In today's lecture, Dr. Petrechin will explore how the rise of radical right populist parties at the local level has influenced migration and asylum policymaking across Western Europe, with a particular focus in Italy. We are very lucky to have you here, and we are very looking forward to your presentation. So thank you to be here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this detailed introduction. Thank you very much, Eduard and Elisabetta, for inviting me here. It's really a great pleasure being here. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is the title of my presentation is indeed really pointing to, again, the role of far-right parties in local migration policymaking and these processes of politicization of local migration policymaking that we are experiencing, I think, around Europe. So I will show you the kind of outline of my presentation in a second, but maybe before the outline, maybe it's worth to maybe establish the relevance of this question and to maybe say a few words about, as in fact you have already mentioned, why it is interesting and relevant to look at the role of far-right parties in local migration policy making. I think this really speaks about two main developments that we are experiencing in European politics and governance in the last decade or 2 decades. The first development is really about this growing importance of the local level in migration governance. So I'm sure that most of you might have heard about this concept of the local turn in migration studies, and this, which is really speaking about this idea that the local level has become increasingly important in the past few decades in Europe. So local governments, on the one hand, they play a crucial role in implementing national policies, but also, of course, it depends on the competencies that they have across different countries or regions, but more and more they have also started to develop their own local policies related to migration, inclusion, asylum, across a variety of different sectors or areas, some from the socioeconomic sphere. You can think about measures related to facilitating access to housing, to education, to or measures that aim to foster social inclusion or contacts between locals and migrants, or anti-discrimination. Or the more cultural or religious sphere. Think about the importance of discussions and policies related to the building of religious buildings, for instance. Think about, the role that local governments have in terms of organizing also, right, how neighbors are organized, or maybe think about measures related to the political inclusion and political participation also of migrants that several local governments have been developing. So for many years, this whole discussion on this local level started in the 1990s. For many years, the focus was on big cities, because these were the localities that were hosting the majority of migrants in Europe. But I think, particularly after 2014, the focus has been also partially shifting towards smaller localities, which have been, as I will tell you, and I will show you also some data in a second, have been receiving particularly humanitarian migrants from in a significant amounts. And this was also something new for many of these small localities, as they had, again, maybe more limited previous experience with migration. And the second important development is, of course, the growth of far-right parties or populist radical right parties. There are many different labels that are used to define these parties, which have been growing and increasing their electoral shares, their electoral consensus in both national elections, but also in local elections. So, well, some data here. I mean, in 2025, if you combine together the votes received by different types of far-right parties in all European democracies, again, then, for instance, in the European Parliament, they are part of different groups, but if you combine them together, right, they become basically the largest party type in Europe. And this is really applying to, I think, all European countries now, with almost no exceptions left. Catalonia was maybe one exception until a few years ago, but now maybe not anymore. Maybe Wallonia in Belgium is the last exception remaining in Europe. And what is important to mention is that this growth of far-right parties has been particularly strong and particularly evident, again, in these small localities. So I found, when preparing this presentation, I found this opinion poll for the US elections. Of course, it's an opinion poll, but right, it suggests that Democrats are leading by almost 40 points in big cities, while Trump and Republicans are leading by 21 points in rural areas. And you see also a range of localities in between, right? Small cities, suburban areas, small towns. So if you combine together the first and the second developments, the question arises, which is, what is the impact of this rise of the far-right parties at the local level for local migration policies, particularly in these small European localities where these far-right parties are particularly strong and have been receiving a lot of votes. So what is the impact of this rise of far-right parties on local migration policies, particularly, again, in small localities? So having said that, this is actually finally the outline of my presentation. Having established the relevance of this question, in the first part of my presentation, I will provide you with a kind of introduction on local migration policies. I assume you know already a lot about this, particularly, right, the students in the room, but maybe I will tell you something specific about local policies in small localities. Then in the second part, I will bring somehow the far right into the picture, and I will start telling you what we have found with colleagues about what happens when the far right enters local councils but remains in opposition. So we'll call this the indirect effects of the far right. So what happens to local migration policies when the far right enters the city councils, the local councils, but remains in opposition? And these findings are mostly based on research that was conducted with many, actually, colleagues as part of this Horizon 2020 project. It's a big research project called HOLCOM. If you are interested, you can also find the website of the project with a lot of material. And it covered 7 European countries, so not just Italy in this case, but also Spain, actually, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And it focused on this time period, 2021-2024. While in the final part of my presentation, I will shift the focus to what happens when far-right parties get real power in local government. When they win the local elections, they control the local executives, the mayor, or the city, the executive level, let's say. And so I will refer to this as the direct impact of far-right parties on local migration policies. And this is mostly based on research that I conducted in Italy, in this case, between 2017 and 2019, during my PhD. So Italy is a particularly interesting case because, as you know, it's a country that has had powerful far-right parties that reached, again, this stage of controlling local governments since the 1990s at the very least. So it's based on, let's say, research conducted at the time, but of course I'm still following what happens, so I will also bring you some more recent, let's say, insights. Okay, so let's start from the first part, and again a few insights on I've already made a short recap of what local migration policies are in the first slide. What are the specificities of small localities? Well, first of all, let's introduce these small localities. Again, there are many different definitions of different types of localities in different countries. So as part of this project, it was really, really hard to come up with a definition that applied to all these 7 countries I've mentioned before. But in general, I think we can define small localities as those that have between 10,000 and 200,000 inhabitants. This is the approach that we adopted, which is per se a group of localities that are per se rather different. So here 3 examples of localities we studied in Italy. Siracusa could be defined as a medium town with 122,000 inhabitants. In Sicily, more or less the size of Girona, it can be compared, right? Cuneo is a small town, 50,000 inhabitants. And then we have Avigliana, a typical example of a rural village in Italy with 11,000 inhabitants. Again, most of the academic literature for many years has focused on big cities, but if you look at it, doesn't apply to all countries, and maybe it doesn't apply to Spain, or I don't know, you will tell me, but in countries like Italy, these are the places where the vast majority of the population lives. In Italy, only 18% of the population lives in bigger cities with more than 200,000 inhabitants. A little share lives in even very rural villages, mountainous areas, very remote places, so with less than 10,000 inhabitants. But the vast majority of the people, right, lives in this type of intermediate, let's say, localities. So I think it's relevant to ask how things are going on in these kind of localities. And so before really looking at the actual developments of the ground, maybe it's important to recall or to mention at least 4 key features that very much influence the way in which these localities have been dealing with migration. And not just to migration, I think these apply to all the kind of local policies that they can develop. So compared to bigger cities, to big cities, I mean, compare Girona with Barcelona, right? Or even compare some small villages in the province of Girona with Barcelona. Of course, these local governments, these localities have a more limited capacity in terms of funding, expertise. Think about the expertise of maybe both the politicians and sometimes the local bureaucrats on average, and of course there are exceptions, but on average, and resources of different types. There are typically a more limited number of associations in these localities compared to big cities. And very often, and this is at least what we observed in this Holcomb project, the local governments of these small localities, they tend to be much more isolated from what we call multi-level governance structures and venues. What does it mean? They tend to have less frequent, less regular exchanges and opportunities to exchange with the higher levels, with the regional level, with the national level, and not to speak about the EU level. There is almost no contact, no exchange between these small localities and the EU level. And also related to the EU level, it's certainly important to mention that small localities have a very limited weight at the EU level. You might know, right, that a lot of funding and a lot of initiatives are taking place at the EU level, but it really seems that these funding schemes and these projects that target the local level have been largely designed having in mind big cities, their needs, their capacity, also the capacity to apply sometimes to some funding schemes, the capacity to implement projects. And this has, of course, implications and impacts for instance, also for the potential of diffusion also of best practices, right, that the EU has been trying to promote in these past few years. Despite these challenges, let's say, as I told you already before, small localities have been receiving growing numbers of migrants and particularly humanitarian migrants. asylum seekers, recognized refugees, mostly as a result of the national policies that were implemented in many countries, the so-called dispersal policies according to which asylum seekers had to be dispersed to all the municipalities in the country. So this is a picture, for instance, of what happened in Austria. So you can see the different municipalities in Austria. All the green municipalities were those that received asylum seekers and hosted reception centers. As you see, excluding a few mountainous areas or more remote places, the vast majority of localities received asylum seekers. The same applies also to Italy. So before actually really looking at the policies in the next slides, maybe one introductory slide about the kind of challenges related to migrant inclusion that we have identified in these small localities as part of this Holcomb project I mentioned before. So what is really happening in the ground, which could explain or be explained, of course, by the policies about which we will say something in a second. First of all, we observed, again, looking at challenges related to migrant and particularly refugee inclusion, very limited social interactions going on between locals and refugees in most of the localities we analyzed. So we had interviews and focus groups with migrants on the one hand. We conducted a big survey with public opinion, with locals, and from both sources it really emerged this picture of, again, very, very fractured, very, very limited interactions between locals and migrants. Second, another challenge we observed is related to the prevalence of particular ways to understand migrant inclusion or migrant integration by the actors involved in doing works on migrant inclusion, and we call them assimilationist understandings. So we asked local politicians, bureaucrats, but also maybe heads of, again, organizations providing services to migrants, what do you think migrant integration is? Who do you think should be responsible for migrant integration? And most of them, as you can see in the graph here in the slide, in the bottom left of the slide, the majority of them replied that it is migrants first and foremost that should be responsible for their own integration. And you immediately can think about the implications that this has for the kind of actions that then these actors developed on the ground. If you're interested, we published an article with Tiziana Caponi and Camilla Borgna on this specifically. Third challenge, we also looked a bit in very qualitative, we have a very qualitative approach in this case. It's access to housing and access to employment in these 36 localities that we analyzed across Europe. This was work actually conducted by CIDOB and actually Blanca Garces Mascareñas and Reinhard Schweitzer in Barcelona. They led this work package. And what we observed in the project was that there were a lot of challenges, particularly related to access to housing from refugees, more than related to access to employment. So especially when in those localities where the economy was doing well, access to the job market, to the labor market was not, on average, so problematic, while access to housing was rather quite problematic, despite we often hear this idea that it is the big cities that are experiencing housing crisis, while maybe small localities are not. Well, on the contrary, we found somehow the opposite. And final challenge, again, when we asked the local population, what do you think that refugees, migrants are well integrated in your locality? Again, this is a result of a big public survey with local residents. The majority of respondents replied that they perceived integration not to have, migrants not to be well integrated. This on the one hand. But on the other hand, when we asked the same respondents whether they agree that more inclusive policies should be developed in both big cities and in small localities, what emerged is a general public support for more inclusive measures. So when we asked respondents, do you agree that more inclusive policies should be developed at the local level for asylum seekers and refugees, the majority of respondents replied that they agreed with this statement. Only 20% replied that they strongly disagreed with this statement. And this is very much at odds and in contradiction with the perception that the politicians we interviewed have of their own citizens and what their citizens require. So when we asked the top-level bureaucrats or the politicians, okay, but what do you think your people want in terms of inclusion policies? Typically, the typical response we got was, oh, but our people really do not want us to develop any policies on migrant integration or migrant inclusion. And I think this already tells us something about the impact of the far right in creating these gaps between and related to the way in which politicians and policymakers perceive public opinion. But I will come back to this in a second. So this was the kind of context, right, where the outcomes, if you want, of what happens in these localities some years after the arrival of many of these humanitarian migrants. But now let's make a step back and let's really discuss which kind of policies were actually developed in these localities. Again, small localities across 7 European countries. Again, we looked at 36 localities, and overall, again, there were differences. Situation was different across different localities, but overall, the picture that emerged was one of largely underdeveloped policies. So not a lot of exclusionary policies maybe being developed, but in many, many localities, very, very little was done on migrant inclusion or migrant integration. Of course, again, there were cases where policies were developed, but again, some measures, for instance, were developed on, particularly on the area of language, of course, something on healthcare, access to labor market, education, but again, very scattered policies, only in some localities, not even in all of them. We observed very, very few, I think only 8 of our 36 localities developed some measures on contact facilitation. So again, trying to, as this is a challenge, as I told you right in the previous slide, this is certainly a huge challenge, the fact that there are no interactions between refugees and locals, and we know that this is also very important for social inclusion, for social cohesion, but very, very little, very, very limited measures were implemented on this dimension, on fostering, again, encounters. Sometimes these are also measures that are not very expensive, right? You contact some NGOs and you put together some initiatives that are sometimes of course they require resources, but other times much less maybe. And the same applies also to measures on what we call on anti-discrimination. Of course, think about the possible measures that local governments can do on this. Very, very few localities had an integration or an inclusion strategy, which is something that, for instance, the European Union has been promoting a lot in these past few years. And we observed, and maybe this was not surprising, because of course monitoring policies and their impact requires resources, and we know that resources are scarce, but we observed very, very little effort to monitor policies and their impact. So our colleagues in Brussels, the Migration Policy Group, they also tried to develop an index, which is called MIPEX-L, a policy index. This is just a screenshot only for the 6 Italian localities, but this was done also for the other 30 localities. Again, I'm not entering into the details here, but if you're interested in the website of this Holcomb project, you find more information about this. Okay, so this is the context. These are the policies that local governments, at least those that we analyzed, but we tried also to select local governments in a rather rigorous way, so to have a balanced picture of different types of localities in Europe. So this is the overarching picture. What happens when the far right enters the local government, either in opposition or in local government? Let's start from the indirect effects. What happens when far-right parties enter the local councils and remain in opposition? What happens to local migration policies? I think, again, this refers to research we did as part of this Holcomb project. We observe a major impact of the presence and also the strength of far-right parties. Of course, it depends, right? If you have one councillor or if you have maybe 10 councillors, the impact can be different, right? So we observe an impact of the local presence and local strength of far-right parties within local councils, an impact on the policies that the local governments controlled by the other parties, the mainstream parties, develop. And this impact is particularly evident and particularly strong, this is what we observe, for more centrist or center-right local governments. While in the case of center-left local governments, the effect seems to be less evident. But again, this is also considered that these were data collected in 2022. So again, things change very, very quickly in this field. And partially we observe also a similar kind of effect when radical right parties are part of the higher level governments responsible for migrant inclusion, the regional government or the national government in countries where the regional level doesn't really exist, as in the Netherlands, for instance, or somehow also in Sweden. So again, a strong effect on policies. Policies become, so local governments, if you are a mayor and you have a strong far-right parties in your city council, you are typically, this is what we observed, much less likely to develop inclusionary policies or even more inclined to develop some kind of exclusionary measures. Why is, well, before going to the why question, maybe to add something on this. This was quite of a striking finding to some extent, because if you look at the literature on, again, local migration policies, for many years there was this idea that the local level is not really affected by party politics or by political factors, political dynamics. For many years there was this idea that, again, local policymakers are the pragmatic ones. They really see the challenges that their people, their localities are facing, and they react pragmatically. They are not really concerned or influenced by party politics. While what I told you in the previous slide is really speaking about the growing politicization of local migration policy making. So just to give you, again, some more information, we asked them, again, we interviewed several policymakers across these 36 localities. And we asked them to evaluate the importance of a long list of factors that you can find here in the slide for the decisions they made in the field of migrant integration or migrant inclusion. So we asked them to evaluate on a scale between 1 to 5 the importance of these factors and look at the 3 factors that emerge as the most important ones. First, values and ideas. Second, public opinion, what the people think about migration, what they ask in terms of integration policies. And third, exchanges with or pressure from political parties that support the majority in the local council. Again, this is very much at odds with this idea, right, that local policymakers merely respond pragmatically to challenges and they are not influenced by political factors. So back to the influence of the far right. How does this impact takes place? What are the mechanisms that explain this impact of the far right in local councils, in city councils, on the decisions of mayors or of local governments? So we, as part of this project, we identify a number of possible explanations. First explanation, for possible explanation, we really observe that the presence of a strong far right within local councils has an effect on the kind of interactions that local policymakers have with civil society, with the private sector, and also with the higher level governments. If you are a mayor and you are facing a very strong far right party in your city council, this is what we found. Also, this is actually a more quantitative analysis that I did with my colleague Giacomo Solano. If you are a mayor and you have a strong far-right parties, you are much less inclined to develop collaborations, cooperation with civil society, or also with the private sector in those places where the private sector advocates for more inclusion measures. And maybe you are also less inclined to develop collaborations, cooperations with the regional government or the national government, maybe especially when the regional government is maybe controlled by the other side, right, politically speaking. And we know that, right, these kind of collaborations and interactions are a very, very important component of local inclusion policies that very often rely on or depend on these collaborations between the public sector and the non-public or private sector. So this was the first mechanism we identified. Second mechanism, the far right has been, this is what we observed in several localities, has been playing an important role in, and this is maybe not surprising because the same happened at the national level, but still it's worth maybe mentioning, has been playing a very important role in terms of influencing agenda setting. So the kind of issues that enter the agenda of local governments. If you want the public debates, the political debates, the agendas of the city council meetings, right? Making migration-related issues much more visible. So issues that in the past maybe were not really relevant, they were done, but nobody maybe noticed that. While far-right parties in local councils have been really playing a role in making all these issues much more visible, in bringing new issues into the political and public debates. And also, and this is also what I found in an article that has actually been published this week, also they have been very much influencing the very decisions that local governments take. And what is interesting, not only the local governments, but also some of the other organizations that are involved in developing inclusive measures. If you are a mayor, or if you are, again, maybe the head of a local NGO, maybe an NGO that is not only working on migration, but maybe on different issues. If you know that there is a strong far-right party at the local level, you are maybe more afraid or less inclined to invest money, resources, time on initiatives, on measures that you know are likely to be attacked by the far-right, particularly, right, inclusive actions. And this is what we observed, right, that and again, particularly center-right and centrist local governments have been, when facing a strong far-right, have been much less inclined to develop inclusive actions. And very often also when speaking with the mayor, speaking also sometimes with, again, some heads of big NGOs, they really told us, right, we know that if we do these kind of initiatives, maybe we can deal with it, but it will be costly, right, in terms of our contacts, reputation, or whatever, because we know we will be certainly attacked and our actions will become very, very visible. Third and final mechanism, this actually relates to research I did in Italy, and I will now tell you something more specific about this research. I really observed, and this is related to what I told you before about these perceptions that policymakers have of their people, that so when the far right enters or becomes powerful at the local level, they tend to, and this is what happened in many countries, and certainly it happened in Italy, they tend to organize or support anti-refugee mobilizations, anti-refugee protests. For instance, protests against reception centers or against decisions to send some asylum seekers to the locality. And these mobilizations, these protests, had very, very powerful, I think, implications for how policymakers perceived public opinion, perceived their local population. And this is at the basis of what many policymakers told me and told us in the other project, that they, again, do not want to develop inclusive policies because the whole population doesn't want it. Our people do not want inclusive measures on integration. But again, this is very much at odds and in contradiction with what we know of public opinion. There is a lot of research done on public opinion to migration, suggesting that if you take the whole population, yes, you have 20-30% of anti-migrant people, but you also have, right, a lot of people with mixed views that are more or less in the middle. You have a few people that are pro-immigration. But again, these protests, sometimes I remember in some villages in Italy, these protests were organized by far-right parties, and they brought a lot of people from outside of the village. They weren't even local citizens protesting, but they provided this idea that the whole population is rebelling against migrants, as some mayors told me at some point. And of course, if you are very much afraid of the local population, if you really perceive the people to be against inclusive policies, of course, what's the result? If you are a policymaker, you are much less inclined, right, to develop inclusive policies, and this ends up fueling the same, or not addressing, or even fueling the challenges that I've mentioned before, right? Challenges related to social inclusion. If you think about how the reception systems is organized, this creates, of course, if you are very passive, if you do not invest time, energy, resources, of course, you will have a very inefficient reception system, which at the very end ends up fueling the same protests, right, that I was telling you before. I think in my region, in the northeast of Italy, between 2016 and 2018, this is exactly what happened. If you look at the opinion polls, it's not true that the whole population is against asylum seekers, but these dynamics was very, very powerful. And again, the far right played really a key role in fueling these protests, these mobilizations that then influenced the policies that were developed and ending up reinforcing, right, the same challenges that were at the basis of these policies. So actually, this is one of the findings of a book that you mentioned before. Okay, finally, third and final part. We have so far discussed about what happens when the far right is in opposition, right? So what happens to local policymakers from, let's say, mainstream parties or non-radical right politicians when they face the radical right within their local councils. But what happens when the far right reaches power? What happens when the far right controls the local executive, the city executive, and the local government at the very end? This is what, I mean, in the literature they are typically referred to as the direct effects, right, of the far right. These are labels that are mostly used for the national level, but I think they can very well apply also to a local level. Again, this is about research that I conducted in Italy between 2017 and 2019, actually. Again, Italy is quite of a specific and interesting case, maybe because, again, as I told you before, there is a long history of far-right parties in government since the end, at least, of the 1990s. The Lega, which is now called Lega for Salvini Premier, formally, and now more recently, Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, the party of Giorgia Meloni. So I analyzed what happens when the far right enters and controls the local executives and the mayors across a number of localities in two regions. In the Veneto region, again, northeast, the region of Venice, a very conservative region. We were discussing about this region before and some of its key features. So again, a region that has a long history of the far right in government. And Tuscany, which is the region, you might, of course, I guess, you know it, the region of Florence in the center of Italy, which has a very different tradition, a tradition more of a center-left or left-wing, let's say, tradition. And what I found is, again, a complex picture. Not all local governments with far-right mayors did develop the same kind of actions or the same kind of policies on migration. So I observed first a very, let's say, frequent decoupling between discourses and actions, between what the mayors and the politicians declared or the rhetorics they used and what they actually did in practice. So very often the policies were very much decoupled from the discourse, the rhetorics. This was the first point. Second point, policies on migrant inclusion or migration, broadly speaking, they varied a lot over time. So even in the same locality, you observed so the same local government over time developed very different measures, sometimes more exclusionary measures, other times maybe a more passive approach. There was a lot of longitudinal, let's say, variation. And third, also across localities, as I told you already, different localities, again, had different approaches, despite the mayors being all from the same party. At that time, it was the Lega, the League, or the Lega, right, the main party. So again, if we want to really see some broad trends in Tuscany, so in the central region of Italy, overall, but again, there were also differences within Tuscany. But overall, the far-right local governments adopted more proactive, let's say, anti-migrant policies, exclusionary policies of different types. They attacked reception centers. They asked the closure, rhetorically, but they also asked the prefectures to close some reception centers. They developed a lot of symbolic exclusionary measures, sometimes measures that had not a lot of maybe impact, but still important at the symbolic level. This is quite well-known politician in Italy. She's called Susanna Ceccari. She was the mayor of a small locality in Tuscany, and she became quite well known also at the national level for these kind of anti-refugee policies. Some were also symbolic. I remember at some point she, for instance, she pushed their municipality out of a national program, one of the reception systems of Italy. I don't want to enter now in the technicalities. And this was a move that was very important symbolically, and she used it a lot rhetorically in her discourse. But again, if you really look at the impact, the number of asylum seekers in her town increased as a result of this decision because of how the reception system works in Italy. You have less refugees from that channel, but more asylum seekers from another channel. But again, this was very important for her at the rhetorical level. While in the Northeast, again, a lot of differences across localities, but overall, I think the trend was more that of inaction or disengagement. So not really neither inclusionary nor exclusionary policies. So a lot of inaction, I think, is really the term that describes the approach that was adopted. But again, with a lot of differences, possibly whenever some other far-right movements started some protests, then the Lega and so the far-right parties supported these mobilizations. Sometimes they even organized some, but they mostly followed other groups that developed protests, and again, particularly at the rhetorical level, they were very vocal in supporting them. But at other times, they even developed some kind of inclusive measures. I mean, this is the current mayor of a town called Treviso, who is called Mario Conte, is not the former prime minister, is another Conte, where he recently, because this is actually an interview he gave, I think, a few months ago, he even ended up declaring, yes, I understand the harsh stance of my party on immigration, but at the very end, migrants are important. They can be the labor force we need in this region, so at the very end, we need more migrants. And he has also developed a number of projects together with the private sector and also NGOs in Treviso, language course, particularly in the area of language and access to the labor market. So a number of, if you want, inclusive measures. So of course the question is, how can we make sense of all of this? Variation across localities, in the same locality over time, and different types of approaches. Can we understand what's the mechanism behind, what's the rationale behind these different approaches? I think one way to make sense of this, I think, based on the research I conducted, is this one here that I tried to describe in this slide. I really think that, again, having interviewed a number of these mayors, a number of these politicians, I really have the feeling that their strategies and their policy approaches are very much shaped by how they perceive the local population, how they perceive public opinion, and especially by how they perceive the public salience of policy issues, how they perceive the importance, the relevance of different types of issues for their citizens, for their local population, on whether they perceive that the choice is highly visible, highly relevant to the people, or maybe less visible, less relevant. So in situations when the salience is high, in situations where the decisions are very, very visible and perceived as very, very relevant by the local population, in these situations, in these contexts, far-right mayors and local governments have mostly tended to develop exclusionary policies or symbolic policies. In other situations or in other contexts where, again, this public salience, this public perceived importance of the decision for the local population, or visibility of the decision, visibility maybe is also an important term here, is perceived to be lower. So for decisions that are perceived to be less visible for the local population, on the contrary, in these contexts, these local governments have either didn't develop any actions, or even sometimes developed inclusive measures, particularly under the pressure of business. Because let's remember that at least in Italy, these parties tend to be very, very close to the business elites, right? To employers, big employers organizations, and big employers organizations in Italy, particularly in the center and the north of the country, keep asking for more migrants, right? And also for more inclusive measures for migrants that are needed as workers, right? And to fill labor gaps that we have in Italy in several sectors of the economy. So when the salience is low, these far-right local governments have been developing inclusive measures. This is certainly, I think, the case of Treviso that I've mentioned before. Of course, particularly on those areas that are maybe particularly relevant for the business sector, language, labor market, and so on. So this is a quote from a far-right mayor I interviewed, which really points to this relevance of interpretations of what the people think and of how important issues are for the people, for the decisions. He said, had I been a simple citizen, I would have simply had certain ideas and kept them for myself. But being a mayor, it is clear that you must interpret what the people feel. That's why I had to develop actions and exclusionary measures, let's say. So this is, if you're interested, this is an argument that we try to develop even more in an article with my former colleague Fred Paxton. Okay, so I think it's maybe time to conclude. So we have identified a number of indirect effects of far-right parties in local government when we are in opposition, right? As we discussed, what we observed, at least in this Holcomb project, is major effects on the policies that local governments controlled by other parties develop, particularly the center-right and the centrist parties, because of the three mechanisms that I've mentioned before, but maybe there are other mechanisms, of course. And again, there are people in this room who are doing interesting work on what happens when the far right is in local government in Catalonia. So would be very curious to hear your thoughts on this. And then we discussed a number of direct effects. So what happens when the far right reaches power and controls local governments. So overall, combining these together, I think we can certainly conclude that the growth of far-right parties has the potential, or maybe has already started, to really change local migration policy making, the kind of policies and the way in which policies on migration are made at the local level. Think about the literature, right? Until a few years ago, all studies were really again pointing to this idea that, well, the local level is really pragmatic, right? Tends to local policymakers to respond to challenges that they perceive, right, from the local level. They are much less influenced by party politics, for sure. I mean, this is certainly still true in some respects, but on the other hand, we really observed a major impact of far-right parties and again, both direct and indirect effects, the ones that I've described before. But of course, this is, I think, still a very relatively new, right, area of research, and I think there are still several open questions that are open. All the findings that I've mentioned so far refer to small localities, but it would be interesting to also maybe again look back at big cities and try to understand whether something similar is happening in big cities. We know that big cities, in big cities far-right parties are much less strong, but there are cities in which far-right parties have also been growing. So certainly it would be interesting to understand whether these same mechanisms also operate in bigger cities. Maybe no, because they have bigger also administrative apparatus. Many of these measures are maybe more in the hands of bureaucrats than in the hands of policymakers. So again, this is an open question. And then second, we have so far mostly looked at the effects of the local strength of far-right parties on local migration policies and discourses, but maybe there is also the other way around. Maybe it's also an interesting question whether the kind of local migration policies or discourses that mainstream parties or non-far-right politicians develop at the local level, maybe also they have an impact on the local strength of far-right parties. So again, this is an open question, but we were discussing before also cases also here in Catalonia where results of local elections and national elections are also very, very different, right? And maybe far-right parties are stronger in national elections, but much less maybe in local elections. And maybe because this might be, I don't know, it's an open question related to the kind of discourses and policies that have been developed by other parties in government. And this connects to the final question. Which strategies can local progressive parties develop in order maybe to, again, limit the rise of far-right parties, assuming that this rise is somehow, not only explained by migration, but very often related to developments in the field of migration. So what are the strategies that are effective in, again, winning also the next election, so developing inclusive strategies, but at the same time winning maybe the next elections and limiting the rise of the far right. I have some anecdotal evidence in mind about Italy of a few mayors that managed to be re-elected even during the years of a so-called refugee crisis when migration was very, very politicized. But again, this is mere anecdotal evidence. I have a feeling that those that were more proactive in the discourse, that were able to control the narrative, control the discourse on migration in a more proactive way, they were more effective than in limiting the rise of the far right, or maybe also sending some signals to the people that they had everything under control, but still developing inclusive measures. Again, this is mere anecdotal evidence, but I think it's an interesting question. Okay. So this is the end of the presentation. Looking forward to receiving your comments and questions.
Thank you very much for shedding light to this relevant topic. Now we are going to open the floor to the audience, as anybody wants to share their thoughts or ask some questions, or what do you want?
I spoke too much.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrea, for this very interesting presentation about the Italian case that speaks to us with a very interesting but also worrisome process and moment we are all living in, and not only in Europe but also in other parts of the world. But for example, here we are doing research on similar topics as you do, and one of the things that we see is there are some parallelisms to these trends, no? How, for example, when the extreme right or the far right is in the in the opposition and also in the government. But also there is another issue that is connected differently, but it connects with it, is the independentist also movement and the polarization of these far-right Spanish parties like Vox, or aquí se acaba la fiesta, and all this type of political parties, and also Alianza Catalana. No, maybe there are some issues of parallelisms with Liga Norte, more or less, but here it's these topics are very strong, and the polarization at the local level is guided and connected to these issues of the independence movement, but with other issues, of course, as well. That's what I'm just thinking about and dialoguing with you about the connections with our context, and also I was like thinking that there is this kind of framing that is being used by not the far right, but liberal right, let's say, no, saying here that okay, we as majors and as government officials at the local level, we cannot control the collapse, let's say, no, and they say, of the city, because the city cannot grow at the levels it's growing now. I'm talking about small and medium-sized cities like you did and in Italy, here in Catalonia. And these narratives are, one of the things that are interesting for us is that these narratives were also present 20 years ago when we were experiencing the same increased rates of migration fluxes here in Catalonia, but the tone, the speed, the rising support that this far-right politicians are having support at the local level is bigger than before. So we think that there are some, of course, drivers that are influencing this increase in this contagion effect, but also the rise of the support of this far-right politics. But also, I'm thinking, can we find ways to stop these narratives, or to recommend policymakers to change the narrative or the frame? Because it's very difficult. During the fieldwork we were doing, one of the difficulties that the left policymakers have, and they say, it's how we can change this framework of securitization, because we don't have the tools to. We want to confront, to change it, but we don't know how to do it. I don't know if in Italy you left or center-left political parties and policymakers have these dilemmas and these difficulties, of these challenges as well. Thank you.
Should I reply, right? Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, super interesting comments. And one very difficult question, the final one is, I think it's a question we are all asking ourselves, right? How can this be stopped? But maybe first one comment on the parallelism with the Lega Nord, and I think it's super interesting. But I think at some point what happened in Italy with the Lega Nord is that they were this kind of more, right, separatist, or anyway regionalist party, and then at some point with when Matteo Salvini became the leader, they changed completely their nature in many respects. So they turned into a more nationalist, right, almost party. And I think this was a move that was beneficial in the short term, because they started to get votes also from the south, and so they increased a lot their consensus. But now in the long term, I think it's we don't know what will happen, but I mean, they have lost a lot of consensus, and there are lots of struggles and disputes within the party between those that ask for coming back to the origin, right, of having this separatist party, and those that are more supporting the current shift. Maybe this doesn't apply to Catalonia. Well, the divides between the two sides on independence are very, very strong, but certainly, I mean, there has been a huge competition in Italy, right, between the Lega and Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, right? So, I think this has contributed at the very end to the politicization about which we were discussing before. So I'm wondering whether this is a possible parallelism with what is happening or might happen here, right? When you have two different far-right parties now, one pro-independence, the other one more nationalist, or however, sorry, maybe I'm not using the correct labels, but anyway, so two far-right parties in competition, and this at the very end ends up fueling, right, this politicization. And on the second question, again, how to stop, certainly the tone, the speed, and this rising support for far-right politics has been also very evident in Italy, although, as I told you, in some areas, these parties have a longer history in Italy, so they were there, and I'm wondering whether there are changes between contexts where these parties are new and where these parties are very established. Somehow this difference between the Northeast, Veneto, and Tuscany, maybe somehow was also a difference in terms of tradition, right? In Tuscany, the Lega was a new party. I mean, they had no experience in power, and they were much more proactive in developing even more exclusionary measures. Maybe because also, right, they felt less established, more challenged, and they had a stronger need for maintaining this support which was largely related to the politicization of migration. So strong incentives to keep politicizing, to keep developing more exclusionary measures whenever they felt that the issue was highly, highly salient. While in Veneto, the story was slightly different. So maybe Catalonia in this case would maybe be more similar to Tuscany in terms of this, if this is true, right, in terms of the context. How to stop it? Again, I think we need the research, right, that tries to tell us something more than mere anecdotes or anecdotal evidence. I have a few cases in mind, but again, these is really anecdotal things. So. But even in Veneto, again, this region with these very, very strong far-right parties, during these years, 2014, 2017, when really there were protests against reception centers throughout the whole region, again, this issue was highly, highly politicized. I think those center-left mayors that managed to win the next elections were those that didn't copy the far right, because if you copy them, you start playing their game and you play in their fields, and therefore the voters tend to prefer the original than the copy, right? First. Second, I think a couple of mayors in particular that were, I think, very, very good in terms of, again, controlling the narrative, controlling the discourse. They were developing very, very inclusive measures, sometimes also some that were even mentioned as examples of very good practices. But at the same time, they were very, very proactive in reaching out to voters, in organizing assemblies where they really discussed issues with the citizens. They were, again, sometimes also sending what some scholars might call these control signals, right? Or we are very inclusive, but whenever some asylum seekers commit any crimes, we are very, very demanding in terms of a level of, so very, very somehow also harsh with those, right? That maybe, so anyway, this really attempt to control these narratives and this discourse. They sent around to all the citizens pamphlets or information sheets with information about all the migrants that were present in the locality, and debunking all the myths around that were circulating around them, bringing facts also, right? I don't know. I think, again, it's anecdotal evidence, but in those cases, even in 2016, 2017, which for Italy were quite some troublesome years, they managed also to be re-elected. Maybe also for other issues. Maybe it's not only about migration, of course. But all the mayors that were the center-left mayors that were very passive, or even sometimes copying the rhetorics, or sometimes they still kept doing inclusive measures, but they didn't speak about them, or even rather used the far-right rhetorics while developing inclusive measures. These were all, I mean, they all lost the next elections. Again, this is mere anecdotal evidence, but I think it's really a key question, right? If you go back to the slide, is how can policies and discourses also maybe shape the strength of the emergence and also the strength of far-right parties, right? The second question here. So actually Tiziana Caponio in Turin, she has now won a big ERC project, which is exactly looking at this, I mean more broadly at far-right parties and asylum policies, but really looking at this link from both sides, how policies, how the far-right influence policies, but also how the policies may be influenced by far-right growth and strength. So, spoke too much, sorry.
Does anybody have more questions or, yeah, go ahead.
En primer lloc, volia donar les gràcies per aquesta conferència. Em sembla interessant i valoro positivament a aquest país, emparats per l'article 20 de la Constitució espanyola, que existeix el dret a la llibertat d'expressió. Estic agraït que la gent pugui expressar lliurement la seva opinió, tot i que a la pràctica tots sabem que no totes les ideologies reben el mateix tracte. Dit això, i amb únicament 8 preguntes cap al doctor, sí que m'agradaria una persona, si el doctor no entén o domina el català o castellà, que pugui traduir les meves preguntes, si cal llegir la meva pantalla, i després que pugui traduir la seva resposta, per tal que la gent que no domina l'anglès també pugui estar informada d'aquesta magnífica conferència. A l'inici de la conferència, un dels companys ha comentat que el doctor, que avui presenta aquesta conferència, havia estudiat la política del municipi de Girona. I voldria saber si coneix la plataforma d'Instagram i, en concret, si coneix la pàgina Girona Perduda, que tracta precisament sobre la realitat social i de seguretat de la nostra ciutat.
He's talking about, he want for us to translate the questions in Catalan, and he asked if you know about an Instagram or website called Girona Perduda. And vols com...
Sí, és per saber si ha estudiat la política del municipi, si coneix aquesta pàgina i una mica què n'opina, si ha pogut veure alguna coseta.
Because you mentioned that you studied a bit of the local municipality and local policy in the level of Girona, and he asked you about your thoughts on that.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. Actually, I think I don't have any answer in the sense that I don't know the details and the specificities of the case of Girona. So I will check this. I think some colleagues of mine working in this Holcomb project also looked at 6 localities in Spain, and I think a couple of them were also in Catalonia. But again, you should ask this question to them. But maybe you can have a look at this website of this Holcomb project, where there are some detailed reports also on for each country. So also for Spain, there is a long report on how these 6 localities that they analyzed in Spain, the kind of policies they developed on migrant integration, the kind of so from different approaches, there is one report on policies, one on these issues of access to services, migrant inclusion, in terms also of social cohesion, outcomes. So in this website, which is I think www.holcom.eu, I can also send you the link then via email. I think there are reports about these different localities, but unfortunately I'm not really knowledgeable about Girona. But maybe some of these things could be also applied to Girona, right? I think maybe when we do this research on the local level, of course there are a lot of differences across all over the places because localities are very, very different. But maybe some trends, some mechanisms, they might also be translated right into different contexts and be relevant as well.
Vale, procedeixo a traduir. Diu que no coneix els detalls com específics de la localitat en si, que té alguns companys que hi han treballat, i que la pàgina web del projecte, que ens pot enviar l'enllaç, o si no és www.welcome.eu, que allà hi ha alguns resultats que podrien ser extrapolables al context de Girona. Òbviament s'haurien com de contextualitzar, no? I conèixer ben bé els detalls, però que hi ha com tendències o dinàmiques que potser sí que es podrien com extrapolar, però s'hauria com això, no? D'aprofundir en l'anàlisi.
Vale, perfecte. La següent pregunta seria saber, és per curiositat pròpia, o sigui, sent el català la llengua pròpia de Girona, i com és que la conferència s'ha fet en anglès? O sigui, tot i ser un idioma important l'anglès, com és que el municipi de Girona, la Universitat de Girona, s'hagi fet en anglès i no en català o castellà, que és un idioma oficial tant a Girona com a Catalunya com a l'estat espanyol. I per saber una mica, la gent que no domini l'anglès o que no el porti bé, de quina forma pot veure aquesta conferència traduïda? S'ofereix alguna possibilitat de poder entendre i estar informat sobre la conferència?
He was asking that why this conference is... vale. Sí, bueno, però per contextualitzar una mica. Vale. No, it was more about to have your information. Okay. Okay. Vols?
De fet, és una activitat organitzada amb l'Institut Europeu de la Mediterrània, que hi ha 14-15 màsters de Catalunya implicats en organitzar diferents conferències i xerrades sobre temàtiques que aquests màsters consideren interessants per portar ponents de l'arc mediterrani. Per tant, ell en el seu cas és d'Itàlia, hi ha ponents, per exemple, que venen d'altres països europeus, ponents que venen de Catalunya, que venen d'Espanya. Llavors intentem adaptar que les conferències siguin en l'idioma, almenys que el ponent estigui més còmode. En el seu cas és italià i com que no a italià el podríem entendre pitjor, diguéssim, potser algú millor, algú no, es fa en anglès, però sí que és veritat que la xerrada està a YouTube, que després ara hi ha possibilitats de traduir, que després ell de la xerrada en fa un petit article, que si llavors algú necessita que es tradueixi al català no hi ha cap problema en traduir-lo. De fet, és una conferència que acabarà amb un article que va molt vinculat amb el que ha parlat, per tant no serà una cosa molt diferent que l'altra, i per tant si algú necessita que la traduïm en català no hi ha cap problema de traduir-la en català i només faltaria.
Perfecte. Era més per saber això, la gent que no el domini, com pot arribar a aquesta informació i tenir-la en compte. Si us sembla, segueixo amb la tercera pregunta, i és per preguntar al doctor, per ell, què entén exactament per l'extrema dreta? Què significa? Quina és la definició? I aquí s'aplica un terme tan greu i amb una càrrega tan important. Qui és? Què ha de fer i què ha de pensar una persona per ser d'extrema dreta? Sí.
Si vols fes algunes de cop, perquè així ell contesti... Tu apuntes ahí, no? Sí. Perquè si no, el pobret miràs per...
Vale.
I si vols pots fer totes les que et quedin, si n'hi ha alguna d'allà que es pot fer diferent, i no pateixis que llavors ella contesti una per una i ja està.
Vale, llavors faig les preguntes i... Vale.
Perquè ella ja s'ho apunta.
Vale, perfecte. Bueno, també volia preguntar, no? Des de la defensa de la immigració que fa, que em sembla genial, en aquest sentit m'interessaria conèixer l'opinió sobre la immigració delictiva, tant la irregular com la nacionalitzada. És a dir, és cert que la immigració pot ser positiva per a qualsevol país, i crec que en això podem estar d'acord, però quines solucions o mesures de prevenció proposa per evitar aquells casos que al final generen inseguretat, no? Especialment per als infants, la gent gran i les dones. També volia saber, que al final ha afirmat que al seu país la immigració està integrada. No estic prou informat sobre aquesta realitat que ens comenta, perquè realment no m'afecta directament. Jo el que sí que conec bé és la situació del meu país i de la meva ciutat. Llavors, aquí molts immigrants estan perfectament integrats, treballen, contribueixen al país, però d'altres no. Potser perquè la llei es protegeix en excés, o potser perquè ningú els ofereix una solució real. Però aquesta situació genera escenes i conflictes al meu punt de vista inadmissibles. I volia saber quina solució concreta ell proposa per a aquests casos. De quina forma podem tenir una bona immigració, tenir una bona ciutat. La número 6, volia saber si el doctor i la resta de col·laboradors consideren que el tema tractat avui és realment d'interès per a la ciutadania. Si vosaltres creieu que la conferència ha estat un èxit, tenint en compte que s'ha anunciat en vies d'antelació, fins i tot des de la Universitat de Girona i mitjans locals, i ho pregunto perquè observar l'assistència a la sala, a la sortida anticipada d'alguns assistents i el seguiment del dret a dur, dona la sensació que es tracta d'un tema d'interès social limitat i m'agradaria conèixer la seva valoració.
I think I understood most of it. So if you want, I can. Well, so if I understood correctly, because sorry, of course I do not speak Catalan, but I think the first question was about how do we define far-right parties, right? And actually, I would not call them extreme right parties, because if you really look at, there is a lot of studies that were done on these parties by political scientists. And in English, but again, I don't know how this translates into Spanish. In English, you distinguish between far-right parties and extreme right parties. They're two different things. Far-right parties are, again, have been analyzed and described by political scientists looking at there is no judgment, okay, in these labels. It's really some objective labels that political scientists have found to measure and identify the positions that political parties have. So they are not center-right, because their policies, their positions are different compared to those of a center-right. While extreme right parties, again in English, are those parties that tend to be also anti-democratic. This is what political scientists told us. In Italy, we have very small parties that could be defined as extreme right, Casa Pound, or so very small parties, while the big parties of the right, the Lega and Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, they are typically called far right. They are not center right. They are not extreme right. They are, so it's really a technical label with no judgment whatsoever. And then on the second question, which, if I understood correctly, was about the effects of immigration in local communities and possible conflicts that might arise, and possibly related to the problems related to inclusion of some of these migrants. Again, I'm a researcher, so to some extent I'm not really interested in this, right? I'm not really interested in judging, right? I'm observing things. So everything I told you is based on data that were collected in the ground, and we again conducted research with conducting public opinion surveys. We conducted I don't know what happened here. Interviews. We observed policies. We developed this policy index, trying to understand which kind of policies have been conducted. All of this is really, we are really observing things. We are not really judging, and in this project in particular, we are not really providing any kind of judgment or any kind of solutions, right? So we are really observing things. Research, there are different approaches to what research is and what research should do, but in this project we were really, merely observing things. So I'm not developing any kind of judgment. I think...
Sí, jo m'he apuntat una mica el que t'ha dit i al final si vols tu dir, però no allargar molt, perquè tens dues preguntes més.
Sí, queden dues més.
You can also, or you can also send me an email and I can happy to reply to the email.
Perfecte. La denúncia és pel que fa a la comunicació. O sigui, volia preguntar si considerant que l'ús de contingut sensacionalitza, que em sembla perfectament. O sigui, jo personalment no ho veig malament. És una estratègia per arribar a la gent i és genial, o sigui, sensacionalitzar el contingut per arribar a aquesta gent, per donar-li una informació correcta i connectar amb les persones. Però volia saber si, al meu parer, no hi ha prou només amb la forma de comunicar, o sigui, cal recolzar el discurs amb dades reals, de l'INE, per exemple, amb estadístiques oficials i dades policials, així com un relat que reflexi fidelment la realitat que viuen dia a dia els ciutadans i els visitants. I voldria saber si vosaltres creieu que actualment s'està fent, aquest exercici de rigor i honestedat, si s'està fent. I després l'última pregunta és, segons el que s'ha comentat a l'inici de la conferència i segons la publicitat de l'esdeveniment, si s'ha pogut comprovar que en molts casos s'ha oferit informació que, al meu entendre, no és especialment rellevant per als gironins i gironines. S'ha parlat majoritàriament d'Itàlia i d'altres països, evitant profunditzar en Espanya i sobretot en Girona, cosa que em sembla important, ja que es fa una conferència a la nostra ciutat, poder conèixer més opinions, més dades dels problemes o beneficis que tenim com a ciutadans. I voldria saber això, perquè s'ha optat per aquest enfocament i no per un més centrat en el context local.
Jo et contestaré després l'altra, perquè tu si vols és...
Did you get the...
No, this time I didn't understand. I'm sorry.
He was talking about all these strategies or discourses that he thinks that we need. I'm sorry for my translation. I'm trying to think in English, but I'm thinking in Catalan. So to give data from resources like national statistic in Catalonia or even in Spain, or opinion from the citizenship or from the inhabitants, that maybe we have to include all of them in our strategies or in our narrative. So do you think that this rigor, do you know? I don't know if in English it's okay. If we are doing this exercise of rigorous information to share all the information related to migration, more or less.
Yes, I think if I understood the question, I mean, this is maybe far from the topic, right, of the presentation, but there is a lot of research that has been done on public opinion and migration, so what the people think about immigration. There is really a lot of research, a lot. So if you want, there is the European University Institute that had developed a huge project on, but also they have done a lot of analysis on what the people think about immigration. And when you look at the data from when you ask, I mean, big samples of local residents, so huge surveys, when you ask the people what do you think about immigration, sometimes the picture is different from what you might think of, right? But again, you can have a look at the website of the European University Institute. They refer to a lot of sources from big surveys that were conducted on public opinion and did a lot of analysis suggesting that somehow, again, pictures is a complex. I mean, there are a lot of people that have mixed feelings, mixed attitudes on migration, and a lot of research that tries also to understand why people have different types of opinions. So again, I can also send you this link. There are a lot of information there. It's not my own area of research, so I can just report what other researchers found. Okay.
Doncs res, volia agrair per fer la traducció, per la conferència, i això seria tot. Okay? Thank you and nice to meet you.
Thank you.
I have another reflection, maybe, that when you are talking about what is happening with progressive parties or progressive policies, right now I'm seeing a series in Movistar Plus that it's Anatomy of an Instant, that it's when the military power wants to appropriate the power of the state in Spain in the beginnings of democracy in 85, more or less. And there's a picture that it appears in that series, that is the president of the Spanish government, that it was blocked with all the problems that he have in the society, and he must take some decisions, but he's blocked it and he's not taking decisions. They have big problems in housing, big problems in neighborhoods, big problems in society, but he was blocked because he doesn't know what to do. And I think that probably we have right now this problem also, that a lot of municipalities have very complex problems that they didn't know what to do. Housing is a big problem. Right now it's so difficult to have access to a house, for example, and I think that it's a big problem that affects after in the quotidian neighborhoods, that if we don't have solutions to the problems that we have, the government it begins being isolated. And I think that this picture of Adolfo Suárez in that moment, that it was isolated, I think it's a picture that what is happening right now. The localities, I think that they feel isolated because they have huge problems that they are not having any response. And I think that this is a way that that some kinds of policies bring more protagonism than, for example, other times that probably we have problems, but it's not difficult to solve them. No? And I think that this picture of isolated, that a president that is isolated, I think that
it's the case that you are explaining that the localities feels isolated, the neighbors feel isolated. When I was working as a as a community worker, the neighbors said me that nobody worries about us, nobody does nothing, and this feeling is increasing because 20 years ago probably we have some responses by the local parties, but right now I think the people, the inhabitants feel that they are so isolated. I don't know if it's a thing that you feel when do you make observations in the research that do you conduct, and if there's something like that the governments probably they are local, and far-right parties they are not local. They know what to do. Probably it's so confused what are they doing, but they know what to do. I don't know if what do you think about that, and thank you for the conference because it's excellent to hear you and your reflections about what you are doing.
Well, thank you. Well, it's a super interesting comment, and I agree. I mean, I completely agree with you. And maybe going back, right, to some of the challenges that were mentioned here, right? I think, and they do not only apply to migration, right? So I think for small localities in particular, certainly in order to, to achieve what you described, certainly you have to address these structural problems of, first of all, of isolation, right? And maybe it's not on them, right? But maybe it's the higher level governments that from the EU to the national level to the regional level that should certainly, again, and some measures require resources, but maybe some other measures maybe could be also done without really investing a lot of resources. Maybe some, for instance, if you think about how the whole access to funding at the EU level works, at the moment, if you are a small locality, it's super hard to even apply or to have access to many of these funding lines that have been designed having in mind the reality of the big cities. So I think as a result of this project, we also were actually asked to write a policy brief for the European Commission, and this was certainly one of the key points. You have to rethink or start thinking about how to adapt all these structures at the EU level, for instance, on the reality of the small cities. We are not, it seems that nothing changed, but maybe 10 years ago it was true that it was mostly big cities, although, it depends, right? But maybe 10 years ago it was mostly big cities that were taking action on migration, but now things have changed. You also have to adapt. So we have, I have the case in mind of some small localities that were also, right, maybe part of this bigger project. There were opportunities to have exchanges with other localities, and maybe this somehow contributed to them feeling a little bit less alone and isolated, right? And they did quite some interesting initiatives. Sometimes also the very few lucky small localities that had access to this broader framework, sometimes because there was a bureaucrat who was right, had the right experience or maybe connections, right, and not connections in the bad sense, but connections in the good way, right, and that perceived the opportunity maybe of being part of this bigger project, and this maybe certainly helped. But yeah, and then more on the political side, yes, for sure. Certainly you have to. If you are. Maybe this is very, very banal thing, and maybe this is not based on research, but on more, right, on other things. But certainly, if you're not delivering on your own somehow also issues like housing, access to dignified jobs, and so on, of course, it's much harder to to be competitive on the debate on migration as well. But we can continue the conversation later.
Okay, so we can close it here. Thank you very much again for coming and for sharing with us all your presentation. And thank you very much for everybody to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
sinó a la posició que ocupa cada partit. Jo crec que defineix els partits de dreta, no parla